Gentlemen, I recognize now the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to start off with a broad question to Mr. Botkins. Do you believe that there is a connection between the $100 billion in additional annual regulatory costs imposed by this administration and the stagnation facing this nation's wages?
There certainly is a connection. And again, I think when you look at sort of the aggregate, regulations are often hidden. They aren't on our tax bill like our FICA or we don't see that in terms of a sales tax, but there is a lot of evidence looking at the impact of regulation on employment. There was a study done looking at the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, and it found sort of marginal impacts on employment, but close to $9 billion in foregone wage earnings as a result of the regulations. A lot of that was through lower labor force participation rate and lower wages down the line. So I don't think that you can see $100 billion and say that that won't have an impact somewhere down the line. Now, I think a lot of this sort of operates under a false premise where we say, well, the unemployment rate is low, regulations can't possibly be having an effect. Well, no one has ever said that a single regulation would cause the unemployment rate to go up to 10%. These are mostly industry-specific examples. And if you look at certain heavily regulated industries, there certainly are impacts on employment and wages. So to discount it and say, well, the unemployment rate is low is sort of disingenuous.
My follow-up question is, last month I chaired a hearing hosted by the Republican Policy Committee on Millennials in the Workforce, and I'm chairing the Millennial Task Force, and one of the themes is the importance of this empowerment economy. So companies like Uber, Lyft, Airbnb that provide greater flexibility. When I visit college campuses in my district, one of the professions that I hear most often from students is that they want to be entrepreneurs. But witness after witness at these millennial hearings raise the challenges of regulatory overreach as to starting their business or growing their careers. Can you identify certain pending DOL regulations that you believe pose the greatest threat to this empowerment gig economy?
Well, some of the regulations that I've mentioned just from DOL specifically, the joint employer rule is one, overtime rule, fiduciary rule. Those are sort of the big DOL regulations coming down the road. I think when you look at regulatory costs generally, especially with small startups, is that these costs fall disproportionately on small firms. So if you're just one or two people starting up a business and you have sort of these fixed regulatory costs, as they tend to be, then you have to spread those regulatory costs over a much smaller pool of assets, in some case just your own money. And you don't have a team of compliance officers or a team of lawyers that larger competitors might have. So if you're just starting out in this new economy and you sort of have a fixed base of regulatory costs, it's going to be tremendously difficult without a lot of capital to get things moving.
Thank you. And Mr. Beebe, I grew up in my family's small business, which is a plywood wholesale company. We have less than 20 employees, and one of our greatest challenges is dealing with regulations. Since you're a small business owner yourself, I wanted to ask you if there are specific instances where regulations have either forced you to delay important projects or have not allowed you to hire additional employees.
A number of times. The regulatory burden, it's directly affected our supplier base. That's one key issue to us, is most of our regulations, we are required as a federal contractor to flow those down. So a business like yours, a plywood supplier, all of a sudden is faced with all these DOD regulations. And lots of times he'll say, I'm not going to supply you plywood. It's not worth it. So that's a direct and obvious thing. The wages for my wife, I would much rather hire a welder, to be blunt, but that's just a cost we have to face.
Thank you very much. I yield back.